points for optimism, mostly in the Southern Cone. And the unfortunate part of that seems to be that you totally have to bottom out as a society before you start coming back up again, or at least that's all the examples that you offer. I was wondering if you had any kind of ideas about how you could recover as a society without going the route of, like, death camps and et cetera.
Well, I think this country is in an economic crisis, and a lot of parts of this country really are bottoming out, and it's still largely invisible. Although there's a little bit more coverage of issue number one, as they call it, on CNN now. But I think that the wave of foreclosures, considering the scale, is incredible, scandalously invisible in our mainstream press. And I think, in terms of the alternatives that have emerged in Latin America, Argentina is an extreme case. They had a run on the banks and a very, very severe economic crisis. But many of the other Latin American countries, it wasn't, some extreme crisis that led to this. It was just living with neoliberalism and its broken promises for 3 decades. Like Bolivia, where they followed the directions of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The promise of trickle-down economics didn't deliver. And I think that the reason why Latin America is so much further along in terms of developing alternatives to this economic model is really because they've been living with the ideology longest. And that's, what I show in my book, is that these policies, even though we say it started with Reagan and Thatcher, it didn't. It started with Pinochet. And so they had, a decade head start of living with these policies. So it kind of makes sense that they're a decade ahead in developing the alternatives.
So we need another decade?
Well, I think it's starting to happen, frankly. I think it's starting to happen, and that's really the discussion we're having now. The real challenge in Latin America right now, and has to do with what the other gentleman was talking about the limits of growth, is that a lot of these really exciting experiments that are happening in Bolivia and Venezuela are still being funded with fossil fuels, with Bolivia it's gas and with Venezuela it's oil. And there's a very interesting discussion going on in Ecuador right now, where you have the continent's, maybe the world's most strongest indigenous movement, very organized indigenous movement, independent of government, which is called CANAI, the Indigenous Federation, National Indigenous Federation in Ecuador. And they're really clashing with their left-wing president, Rafael Correa, who is very much a classic left-wing developmentalist economist. He trained in the U.S., and his vision is extraction of natural resources and redistribution, and investment in healthcare and education. And he's getting this tremendous pushback from CANAI and from the environmental movement, which is also very strong in Ecuador. And they're saying, we want to leave the oil in the ground. Because the oil that they want to extract in Ecuador is in the Yeltsin National Park, which is a very incredibly rich region of it has more species per hectare than in all of North America. It is a global treasure. It should not be spoiled through extraction. And they're saying leave it in the ground. And Rafael Correa is saying, well, he's really been clashing with them and said some really ugly things about how they don't want the country to develop, and dismissive of infantile environmentalism. And they came up with a compromise, and the compromise they came up with is a concept called ecological debt. And I think it's the most important idea of our time. And their idea is that rather than them not having money for healthcare and education and all the things that they need because they chose to leave this oil in the ground that should be left in the ground, that we should pay them, we, the rich world that created the climate crisis for them, because, as the previous speaker said, we are the ones who are consuming so much, not them, but they're on the front lines of climate change. It's an alien nation. And that we should pay them to leave that oil in the ground in the Yeltsin National Park, so that they don't have to choose between education and healthcare and infrastructure. And there are new, fields of economics that are trying to calculate, what ecological debt would actually mean. How would we calculate it? And I personally think the oil companies should kick in a bit. I mean, you've got Exxon posting $40 billion in profits in a single year, and we're being told that there maybe isn't enough money for alternative energy in this country, right? They have stuck us with the mother of all bills, okay? And in this period of high energy prices, all of that money has just gone into the pockets of shareholders, and it's a travesty. So I think that as we move to the next significant climate summit, which is Copenhagen in 2009, that's when the post-Kyoto consensus is going to be developed. I think people really need to focus on this because we're being sold a bill of goods on climate change, and it's called market-based solutions. Okay? Market-based solutions says we can leave the market to fix the climate crisis through things like trading in pollution, carbon trading, green venture capital. We are seeing the market work right now, and we do not want this market, to create another bubble out of carbon trading, out of green venture capital, and just wait for it to trickle down. This needs real management, real intervention, and it needs real resources, and we know where those resources are. So I think, leading up to Copenhagen, we need to really shift the discussion, shift the terms of the discussion away from market-based solutions to this idea of ecological debt, because it challenges, it deals with a lot of problems all at once.